We're recording.
Okay. Good afternoon, you guys. I really appreciate you guys coming here. As I'm sure you guys already know, my name is Andrew Strunc. I'm a senior here at Northwest Missouri State, and I'm majoring in political science. First and foremost, I want to thank the Northwest Center of Policy and Civic Engagement for the collection of the data and surveys that they did to make this possible. I want to thank Dr. Herrera for compiling that data into R for us, and last but not least, Dr. Casey for taking me under her wing on this project and kind of giving me the opportunity to learn from her and what it takes to do a more in-depth political science research and hopefully take that to the next level in grad school for me. With that being said, this is my presentation, Confusing the Voting Booth When Partisanship and Policy Collide. And that is based on the paper that Dr. Casey and I worked on. Are Missourians voting for conservative candidates and liberal policies? A case for ballot measure ticket splitting. Our central question was, do voters support candidates from one ideological position while endorsing ballot measures from the opposite? In other words, are voters casting ballots for all Republican or Democrat candidates and then voting for policies that go against that interest? Our hypothesis is that voters are increasingly voting straight tickets for candidates and voting for one or more ballot measures that either ideologically different or not supported by their party, or even more so, supported by the opposing party. We label this concept as ballot measure ticket splitting, or BMTS, while candidate ticket splitting aims to study partisanship through candidates. BMTS divides between candidates and issues. Previous research provides some critical points to understand about voter behavior. There are some key assumptions made that leave a gap for further research. Parable Squire begins by saying that initiative and referendum voting differentiates state from national politics, essentially saying that institutional change shapes the voter's structure of choices. Randall Holcomb continues by saying that voters adopt candidate preferences with a limited role for citizen-driven policymaking. This is pretty contrast to the mainstream political science view that public opinion shapes policy or candidate ideology. Whereas in this system, he's saying that it is top down and that candidates create the positions, and even goes as far as saying that elite competition saves democracy, saying that if every candidate held the same ideology, there would be no change in the voter stance or behavior. Burton and Kimball finally state that candidate ticket splitting emerged due to local competition rather than ideology, and that CTS is a reaction to candidate strength, quality, name, and spending. They're saying that vote is for the should be winner rather than their ideological representation. There are some key assumptions here, though, essentially saying that each of these authors are saying that voting is a reactive force. So Squire is saying that voting is reactive to institutional change. Holcomb is saying that voting is reactive to elite ideology or stance. And then Burton and Kimball are stating that, uh, sorry, Burton and Kimball are stating that voting is reactive to the candidate's strength rather than more so their ideology. So the main dichotomy between candidate ticket splitting and policy or ballot measure ticket splitting is that candidate CTS refers to instances where voters distribute their candidate selections across multiple parties. The key characteristic is that the voter is changing partisan alignment across offices. For example, a voter might select a Democrat president or Republican for Senate. Ballot measure ticket splitting represents a form of candidate policy decoupling, whereas voters anchor themselves firmly to the party's candidates while simultaneously exercising policy autonomy at the issue level. This behavior reveals a meaningful issue divergence within partisan coalitions. Rather than weak party alignment or identity within CTS, ballot measure ticket splitting reflects the exact opposite dynamic: high partisan identity paired with independent policy judgment. As I'm sure a lot of you guys are aware, polarization in America has rapidly spiked since the 2000s. As we see here, with even from 1994 to 2017, there are much less moderate liberals and much less moderate conservatives over time. And as a result of that, we have seen that partisan loyalty at the candidate level has heavily increased. and yet issue-based independence may have increased as well. Voters now behave as a partisan identifier, but rather than a consistent ideologue. And at the end of this, hyperpolarization creates partisan dominance in candidate races and leaves ballot measures as the last opportunity for ideological crossover. And as Burton and Kimball state, any empirical study of the causes of ticket splitting must begin with accurate estimates of the frequency of this behavior. Missouri was a great example of a bellwether within the country up until the 2000s. And as we see here, even though a Democrat senator won in 2006, statewide Republican was still a majority. That was when stem cell research was passed, which was a liberal policy. And then as we see down the line, we are still becoming yet and yet more Republican, with 2020 to 2024 having straight ticket across the line, winning president, governor, and senator every time. And yet, as in 2024, the most liberal policies were passed in Missouri with abortion rights, sports betting, and a wage hike. Because for our data and methodology, our source was the Northwest Policy and Civic Engagement Center exit poll. And because there's not a universally acknowledged standard for determining whether a ballot measure is ideologically liberal, progressive, conservative, or partisan, we had to essentially state how we are going to define that. And so what we did is we resulted that voters often rely on partisan cues or heuristics, such as endorsements from candidates, interest groups, organizations, or political parties, to assess whether initiatives and referendums align with their ideological preferences. After that, we looked at demographics, and so we accounted for education, age, sex, marital status, kids, and even the lean of their ideology. After that, what we did is we took those and we identified these straight ticket voters. And what we did is we took the president, senator, and governor. And so, as I restated, a straight ticket voter is someone who votes Republican or Democrat across the line for all three of these. After this, what we did is we tracked their votes on numerous amendments that were being passed in Missouri during this time. Amendments 2, 3, 5, 7, and Proposition A. And the goal was to measure the frequency and pattern of ballot measure ticket splitting in this time. The first thing that we see is that partisan identification and straight ticket voting. And we see that partisan identity is strongly predictive of straight ticket candidate voting in Maryville, with both Republican and Democratic identifiers exhibit very high rates of partisan consistency at 82.44 and 87.27% respectively. This shows that candidate selection in Missouri remains highly polarized and high levels of partisan loyalty despite policy level divergence. These are the amendments that we decided to look at. Amendment 2 was a liberal measure which allowed online sports betting, which was for a long time heavily in 2012, Republican senator in Missouri was heavily against online sports betting. And so in Amendment 3, the right to reproductive freedom, there's a liberal measure accounted for. Amendment 5 was a 13th casino on the Osage River, and Amendment 7 was the ban of ranked choice voting. And then last but not least, Proposition A raised the minimum wage to a maximum of $15 an hour and allowed for sick leave. The first thing that we notice, and that I think is extremely prominent, is the support for Amendment 3 reveals a pronounced partisan divide, but it also illustrates the core dynamics of ballot measure ticket splitting. Democratic straight ticket voters were overwhelmingly supportive of the abortion rights initiative, with more than 97% voting yes. Republican straight ticket voters moved in the opposite direction, but even here the data shows meaningful variation. Roughly 15% supported the measure, and despite this chart not showing, the divergence between the Republican men and women is very vast, with 12.5% of Republican men in support and over 18% of Republican women. Independent Republicans exhibit slightly higher support than partisan Republicans, while non-affiliated Democrats remain broadly aligned with partisan Democrats. Support levels among ballot measure tickets splitting for Amendments 2 and 5 are noticeably similar across Republicans and Democrats and independents, with no group displaying overwhelming polarization. Republican straight ticket voters register support in the mid 40s, while Democratic straight ticket voters fall only slightly higher, suggesting that issue-specific considerations rather than party identity guided decision-making in this process. The near-identical support levels among non-affiliated Republican and Democratic voters further reinforce the interpretation that these measures elicited cross-ideological convergence. These patterns demonstrate that ballot measure ticket splitting is not only confined to socially charged issues like abortion, but also extends into routine economic and administrative policies. The cumulative ballot measure ticket splitting behavior among Republican is also quite interesting. Republican straight ticket voters demonstrate that issue level divergence is not an isolated anomaly, but a recurrent behavioral pattern. A clear majority, with roughly 62%, supported at least one liberal ballot measure, indicating that even highly partisan voters engage in selective policy evaluation rather than uniformly rejecting liberal initiatives. The number frequency declines as the number of liberal measures increases, yet nearly 80%, 8% support all four, revealing a small but meaningful subgroup whose policy preferences diverge substantially from partisan expectations. These results essentially underscore that Republican partisanship, while strong in candidate races, does not fully structure policy attitudes. Instead, voters exercise issue-specific autonomy, contributing to a measurable and cumulative pattern of ballot measure ticket splitting. Here we see the frequency of liberal measure support among Democrat straight ticket voters, with nearly 2/3 of Democratic voters opposed at least one liberal ballot measure, signaling that even within a reliably liberal policy coalition like we saw here, policy-specific disagreement persists. Most defections involve only one or two measures and virtually none opposed all four, suggesting that Democratic ballot measure ticket splitting is less ideologically extensive than what is observed among the Republicans. Even so, the presence of consistent opposition patterns demonstrates that Democratic partisans also engage in selective policy evaluation rather than uniformly endorsing their party's ideological position. For theoretical interpretations, this kind of goes back to the literature review in which we discussed. From what the empirical data that we gathered, ballot measure ticket splitting appears to emerge from three key interactions. The first is polarization. As polarization has increased, we have seen a consistent drive in straight ticket voting among both Republicans and Democrats. But we are not seeing this same drive or spike in a positive correlation with ideology. So at the state level, among policies, liberal ballot initiatives are still being passed among Republicans and Democrats alike. The second key interaction is the direct democracy. While it's not necessarily the motivation, it is the enabler for ballot measure ticket splitting to occur. Without direct democracy and without these ballot initiatives, there would be less room or opportunity for ballot measure ticket splitting to occur. And then finally, identity and self-interest can moderate ideological consistency. So as we saw with the Republican women, they are much more likely to support an abortion rights initiative than Republican men, signaling that the self-interest is larger of political identity than partisan or other political scientists offer. So in the end, ballot measure ticket splitting is a structural consequence of polarization, and democracy enables issue-specific voting. When locked into partisan identities, ballot measures are an outlet for nuanced political judgment. And the broader implications of this is that potential realignment in partisan values as public opinion changes. So this kind of goes back to the mainstream political scientist idea that public opinion can shape candidate ideology or partisan stances. And so as this becomes more prominent over time and polarization increases, we could see a potential change in partisan alignment in terms of ideas or values. Ballot measure ticket splitting suggests voters are both ideologically and individually pragmatic. So even though individuals are voting for candidates at a certain level, there is much more room for ideological nuance or decision making when it comes to state level policies. And then Similar behavior was shown in Kansas, Ohio, Kentucky, and Florida. Each of these had multiple liberal measures passed, and yet still staying predominantly Republican states. And so that kind of goes into my conclusion. Voters in the survey were straight tickets for candidates and splitting votes on supporting ballot measures that their party did not wholly support, with 60 over almost 62% of Republicans, almost 32% of Democrats split tickets between candidates and ballot measures. It's important to distinguish between candidate ticket splitting and ballot measure ticket splitting, since as voter practices have shifted due to polarization, we are seeing different voter behavior. At the end of the day, though, more surveys are needed nationwide, and we need to examine where else ballot measure ticket splitting can be prominent.
Do have a question. So it seems to me that the way that you operationalize the way, and correct me if I'm wrong, and it's can you stay plugged in?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Okay. The way that you operationalize whether a ballot initiative was liberal or conservative
Correct.
is that you looked at the endorsement, is that correct?
We looked at endorsement, partisan or candidate rhetoric and how they described it. So when I mentioned but when I mentioned uh, where was it? When I mentioned the online sports betting measure, Republican senator in Missouri went out explicitly stating, I'm forgetting his name, but
Sure.
went out explicitly stating that like this is not something the Republican Party supports, and yet, go ahead.
So what was your parameters there? Like, I mean, I could theoretically think of a situation where one representative goes out and says, "I'm against this," and so you labeled it as a liberal or conservative ballot measure, but there was perhaps other politicians. So how did you?
Yeah. So there were we didn't just look at kind of like you mentioned, like one or two candidates. We also looked at special interest groups and uh, or was it other candidates that are running within that party, special interest groups, lobbyists, things that are associated with those parties. And so when we look at that, we saw a pretty broad, or not maybe not broad, but pretty generally accepted within that party. So while there may be nuance within a few statements among one or two uh,
Initiatives.
politicians, yeah.
Okay.
The general idea is that um, because of all the other things that are being shown, it's not necessarily a mixed liberal or conservative policy. So,
Ballotpedia does classify,
Oh.
not an official classification, but they do have,
A label.
here are the groups, the people, the support, so
Oh, nice.
it makes,
I didn't know that.
yeah, it makes that pretty streamlined.
Okay, so you rely on Ballotpedia as a source of that. Okay, I trust Ballotpedia, so I like that. Okay, I had one more question. I actually have more than that, but one more, and then I'll stop and see if anyone else has questions. Did you did to it looks like you're when you say non-affiliated Republicans, that's like the lean Republic. They're not registered, but they lean Republican or Democrat.
independents who voted straight ticket Republican.
Oh, okay. Very cool.
Maybe I didn't frame that.
All right. No. I like what you're saying there. So here's my question.
Yeah.
Why did you focus on partisanship instead of ideology in your measure? Why not rely on ideology to say, hey, how conservative to liberal you are, and see if you're consistent as opposed to party identification?
I think that would, like I said earlier, I think more surveys need to be done, and I think that would be a great one to do. But for this, um, there were simply not enough independents at this point right now. I think there were maybe like 15 independent voters within the survey, and so while if this was a larger scale study, I think that could prove to be a good method in terms of getting the survey. But as of this right here, it seemed that it was extremely divided in terms of ideology, but extremely strong in party. So I think we had it was like what was it? Yeah, there were 75. There were 75 non-affiliated compared to the 235 and 165. And the independent did not seem to show uh, as much partisan alignment, if that makes sense. So our main question was why are you so strong in terms of candidates towards a specific party as opposed to policy measures? And so by looking at ideology, that that would kind of take out the other aspect of the partisan loyalty aspect that ballot measure ticket splitting kind of analyzes. Does that?
Yeah, I'd also imagine that most people they're surveying don't actually know the distinction between partisanship and ideology.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a moot point in that. I mean, you'd probably just be confusing uh, your respondents.
Yeah, and even to take it back more, just that idea of were voters voting straight tickets. I mean, I wasn't even sure of that before looking at this particular data. So I was surprised at how many voters were voting straight tickets, particularly in this election. I thought there might be more splitting of tickets, and there wasn't. And then bringing in the ideological parts.
And I guess the literature probably, I mean, because they're talking about split ticket voting, they're talking about parties.
Yeah.
So you're being consistent with the literature by sticking with party instead of switching to ideology, which would be inconsistent.
Yeah.
So
the other interesting thing is when we were kind of going into this research, because Missouri is predominantly a red state, with liberal ballots still being passed, it was unexpected to see how many straight ticket Democrats were also going back and voting for Republican initiatives. And so even though it's not as extreme or uh, vast or polarized as the Republican side seems to be, it still is definitely something to look into for further research on maybe some blue states with more conservative ballot initiatives. So.
This is not my field, so just tell me if I'm way
It's not
off.
mine either.
But I have in the past, I think, seen a disconnect with respect to certain types of legislation, such as the Affordable Care Act, where you ask people, do you favor or not favor the Affordable Care Act? And you can get a high negative on that. But then if you poll people with respect to particular provisions, they poll much higher. They like the provisions.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there's a relationship here that the candidates are kind of just names, like the Affordable Care Act, and you react to the name and you react to the public buzz. But when you start going into the details, people start to evaluate individual policies and decisions. And
especially for the education one, I think that's a great point for the education one. Like how many Republicans voted for it because I'm sorry, because the gambling provides funding to education, and even though they oppose the gambling, they support the more money to education or something like that.
It'd be interesting also in the survey to maybe ask where they think gambling taxes or education funding comes from. So if they are aware,
but the ballot initiative specifically, unless I'm incorrect, I think the ballot initiative specifically connected some of the revenue for the gambling to the education. So it was like earmarked in that way. Yeah.
Some of the further research that I would like to look at or do would be looking at certain geographical areas within these states and essentially I would assume that, or theorize, that most of these straight ticket Republicans, at least voting for more liberal measures, are going to be in those suburban, on the line of downtown areas, because even though they may have those, I don't want to say predetermined from their parents, but inherited sort of partisan loyalty.
Yeah, socialized.
Yeah, socialized partisan loyalty. And then, but because they are so close in interaction with some of those lower income neighborhoods who are more predominantly Democratic, it would be interesting to see how that would play out within those areas and cities. So,
There's so many rabbit holes to fall
Oh, yeah.
down here.
Yeah. Well,
And I think that what became clear in the writing of this is we first need to put out there what this is, that there is
Right.
something different going on than just split ticket voting. And
no,
so,
I agree. I mean, it's you're constructing a new measure that we're not looking at.
yeah,
And so I guess my last question, and then I'll refrain, but my last question is a theoretical one. So I asked you two methodological questions and I have a theoretical question on how you are envisioning that your micro level theory of your paper to the broader literature. And so this is my question. Um, you're how are you articulating what your research means for our broader understanding of polarization? Because the researchers are saying we're polarized, we're polarized, we're polarized, but it almost seems from my perspective that theoretically you're saying, well, hold up here though, because there's something else driving this, and you mentioned identity. So how much do you think your paper here, your model is uh, uh, what do you how would you say that what overarching does that have to say about polarization in the country today?
well, I think that this also shows because polarization is increasing, and as polarization increases, partisan loyalty and candidate loyalty goes even further. And so, but because ideology or ballot initiatives are kind of staying the same, or even seem like they're closer together than everywhere else, kind of makes it seem. I would assume or like to theorize that polarization is stemming more from the politicians and stemming down. And so when people have stronger candidate loyalty, they may exhibit higher signs of polarization. But when they get to the voting booth and they have that opportunity to have more, like I said, nuanced judgment in terms of initiatives that they'll see within their state. I think that people maybe are more moderate than they assume because of party.
That's why I interpret what you're putting out here, and this is a follow-up, so this isn't a new question, so I can keep talking. So what I've seen here is you're okay. You're saying polarization is an elite-driven model. That's kind of how I read the congressional literature, so I'm with you on that. Okay. But you're saying, uh, so is it that when it comes to the ballot, when you're in the voting booth, that are, do you think that it is that you are saying, okay, I'm in the voting booth now? Is it that people are inconsistent without knowing it? Is it that they really don't know, the American people don't know that they're being inconsistent? Or is it that they know, but when they're confined in a booth and they're looking at policy and policy implications, they start to then throw out the group dynamic in favor of like the self-interested policy?
So one interesting way that I've actually thought about like further research on this topic, and that kind of goes similar to what you're saying, is if there was a survey with policy initiatives, and at the bottom of every policy initiative, the yes or the no or approve or decline had the kind of like predominantly determined partisan identity with it. So like if they went through and saw that adding another casino on the Osage River is a liberal initiative, I would theorize that more Republicans would say no to that than they did originally because they don't see or maybe don't entirely know the party alignment in terms of. Do you get
So
what I'm
you
saying?
you think it's as a function of them not in the voting booth, they're not connecting the amendment in a partisan way.
Correct.
Okay.
I think
I
it's
think
an
that's a fair
interesting thing to
argument.
look into.
Yeah, yeah.
Again, like education would be something to look at into this. Um, from what I understand, education had a couple interesting points that we were able to take out, but I don't think that there was enough higher education individuals within the study to really get like um, a real grasp of exactly
And the
how.
variation in education.
Exactly, yeah. So again, this is a sample size of 475 people.
Yeah, yeah.
And so the different surveys I would like to look at or like examine would be education, geographical area within urban cities, or identify where the liberal ballot votes are most coming from, and then going in there and looking at where that split may be occurring. So
You know how we could do that? We could measure that by in the next survey, we can have the amendments and then we can ask you, what is your perception? Do you think this is a liberal or a conservative amendment? And then we correlate that with their answer and then we can see if they actually
even-
know or don't know.
you could even
You
do
could
like
do
a
an easy
full-
follow-up study.
like how heavy or how conservative leaning is it?
Yeah, yeah.
I know the initiative of the casino, that had a lot to do with where you lived as to how you voted.
Yeah, that's
If you were
right.
in a county along the Osage,
You were, yeah.
you probably voted for it, and if you weren't, oh well.
That's a
They,
good point.
they didn't even get, St. Louis City didn't support that one, so,
That's interesting.
yeah.
And Amendment 3 is so hard because it's such an outlier case. I mean, I can't think of a policy, to be honest, where identity matters so much more than ideology than the policy of abortion. Like,
Until 2026 and the new one comes on the ballot,
Yeah,
that's
yeah, yeah.
gonna be explosive.
And-
But I think in terms of the way I saw this, and one of the things that I think is more in the paper itself is Missouri has not been classified as a Republican state
mhm.
for very long. And so are voters quite as conservative as they think they
Yeah,
are?
yeah.
Because, yeah, they see the names and everything and they jump at the candidates. Are they really feeling that
They haven't
way?
been socialized long enough.
Yes, and that may explain some of the reverse action as well, where you've got people voting for the Democratic candidates because they don't like the Republican options, but yet at the same time, they're feeling, they're a little bit more on the conservative side than the typical Democrat. So that may explain some of that. So this may be a Missouri specific scenario. That doesn't mean that BTMS isn't still happening elsewhere, but
Right.
are the reasons different elsewhere?
And kind of to go on to what you were saying, the assumptions that each of these authors make that I mentioned, like I said, kind of leave a gap for further research with ballot measure and ticket splitting, because these are primarily candidate and partisan rather than ideology or ballot, or even like crossing over the two and see how they kind of converge. But Burden and Kimball, I think, are particularly interesting in this because they mention that candidate ticket splitting can result because even if one person might not fully agree with them, they're still going to be pragmatic and try and vote for someone who they think is going to win. And so maybe that could even extend into people seeing the Republican Party as a whole, or seeing Republican candidates within Missouri and kind of influencing partisanship in that way. And then maybe seeing how, like, kind of like you said, maybe they don't even realize how maybe like not Republican they are yet. And so especially with the type of rhetoric that has been coming out in politics and how Trump kind of has that like strong arm type of presidential role that he kind of advertises himself as. That's very enticing to some people, especially when they're already in a more predominantly red state. And so I think that is another interesting thing to maybe look into as well. So I'm interested to see where polarization is going to go in the next few years, because I know you showed us that graph in public policy, which I almost wanted to put in here, was like according to the index and polarization, we're almost at like a 1.0. And so like as polarized as you can get, but like we're kind of showing here that could be more towards partisan loyalty than
Yeah, the polarization is happening at the level of group identity, not at the level of policy preference.
exactly.
And I think that's a super interesting finding because it kind of, in a way, pushes back against the polarization narrative in a unique way that I've never seen before. And maybe, yeah.
I would also look into age. I mean, obviously you can look into every single demographic, but if I had to pick like a top three that I like would really want to look at, I would want to look at like geography, like where are they in the city, age, and then I would like to see religion. I think that's an interesting thing that's happening right now, especially with some more at least in the Catholic Church, there's more like liberal rhetoric coming out. Like there's a bunch of U.S. bishops coming together and basically talking about deportation of illegals and stuff like that. Like the Catholic Church has become heavily political in the last few years.
Yeah, they just wrote an open letter to Trump.
Yeah.
Yesterday, right?
Yeah, and Pope Francis did something similar. And so again, it's or like even discussing, obviously Palestine Israel is not an American a side issue, but
Yeah, I don't know if people
but there was
Israel
but there was
has strong
specific
opinions.
but there was specific rhetoric that was used towards America's policy in Israel
Sure.
and Palestine from the Catholic Church. And so
Oh, I see.
and so even in foreign affairs or foreign policy, the Catholic Church is becoming more and more political. And so I think it would be interesting to see how maybe a straight ticket.
Ballot initiatives.
Exactly, yeah. And then for age, like I think especially like college areas, there are many different walks of life that you encounter in a college environment, or especially just in your 20s in younger years. And so it would be interesting to see that kind of like socialized partisan loyalty that you mentioned earlier, and combined with seeing many different viewpoints from others, and kind of maybe how that will differentiate in terms of ballot initiative voting. So.
Good.